All right. Hey there, and welcome to this episode where we're going to continue our series on intrusive thoughts. And in this episode specifically, we're going to talk about intrusive thoughts that are around sexuality. So, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Matt Cotty, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the founder of Restored Minds and the creator of the AAA Response. And before we dive into this episode, I'd really appreciate if you could take some time to help support the show by liking and subscribing, as well as even leaving a comment or question below, and potentially even leaving us a review over on iTunes. It would really help us, and we very much would appreciate it. So, and for those of you that are looking for help with intrusive thoughts or OCD or anxiety or really anything on that spectrum, I have some links right down in the notes that will direct you over to a free guide as well as a workshop you can get started on. And there's additional resources over at restoredminds.com. So let's go ahead and dive in. So, if you haven't, watched or listened to the first two episodes of this series on intrusive thoughts, please do so. Because again, this is all going to kind of build on itself. And when it comes to intrusive thoughts, again, we're talking about thoughts that are just invading a person's awareness. And we're talking in the last episode, we talked about why trying not to think intrusive thoughts actually makes them worse. With the white bear effect. And what I want to talk about today is really this idea of specific intrusive thoughts. And I want to kind of go into the series here and talk about different themes. And so in this one specifically, I want to talk about just kind of some intrusive thoughts that commonly kind of try to, really attack one's sexuality. And there's really, when you talk about intrusive thoughts, they kind of fall into three main categories. You have sexual intrusive thoughts, you have harmful intrusive thoughts, and then intrusive thoughts that are usually related to one's faith or religion or existential ideas. And, again, there's so many ways that these manifest. So I'm going to kind of talk about those three categories on a broad context, because I don't believe it's valuable to dive into the internet's done such a great job now of coming up with all these subtypes of OCD and anxiety. And the problem is that now people think that they have like multiple disorders, when it's really like they just have different intrusive thoughts popping into their head. So they might have intrusive thoughts that are, harmful in nature. They might be like, well, I have harm OCD, and now I have, sexual orientation OCD and pedophilia OCD. And then I have, scrupulosity, and I have this. It's like, no, we're talking about the same mechanism. Right, we're talking about the same exact mechanism. And so thinking that you have all these different forms of OCD is not helpful, and it won't be helpful on your journey to recovery. And so I really encourage you to let that go. And on this episode, I want to just talk about, intrusive thoughts related to sexuality. So, and I want to start off by saying, like, look, I'm not like a sexuality expert. It's not my area of study, right? But there is specific differences when we're talking about OCD and anxiety versus actual issues that are related to sexuality. And I want to just kind of discuss that. So when we're talking about intrusive thoughts in the realm of sexuality, what we're talking about here are intrusive thoughts that are invading a person's mind and causing them to question or doubt their very identity. And these are very, very different than sexual desires that someone is experiencing. And I just want to really distinguish that for a second, right? These thoughts are going to be ego dystonic, right? Is how we categorize them, right? Not ego syntonic, meaning when something is ego syntonic, it aligns with you at your core, right? Of who you are. Right. Versus something that's ego dystonic is something that it's like, hey, this doesn't resonate. Like, I don't want these thoughts. I don't find these thoughts appealing, and they cause disgust generally. Right. As opposed to thoughts that are causing someone, again, arousal. Right. Or, fantasies that are causing someone arousal. So they're very, very different. They're intrusive. They're ego dystonic. And they are generally, they generally produce feelings of disgust, right? And shame, and just like, they're thoughts that people would, because they're intrusive, they're thoughts that people aren't acting on, right? This doesn't drive behavior. In fact, usually it drives the opposite behavior of like, you know, seclusion, right? Secluding yourself, isolating yourself, being away from, people that potentially trigger these thoughts, all that stuff. So, some of the most common forms of sexual intrusive thoughts that people encounter are things like questioning their sexuality, right? And so, when we're talking about whether someone is gay or straight, and it, but I mean, this can also go into things like whether someone's trans or identity questions, right? Things like this. And this is what's happening is the mind is producing thoughts like, what if this happened, or what, like, trying to analyze an event, like what if I turned gay, or what if I turned straight, right? And because I've worked with people who have both issues, and generally what you're looking at here is the person has maintained a certain identity for their life, and then generally this onset of anxiety started, and then the anxiety, the what if thoughts, started to attack the person's sexuality. And the person generally is very concrete in knowing who they are, who they really are, right? And the intrusive thoughts are attacking that. So, and because again, there's people that have, again, been totally, again, comfortable with the idea that they're gay, and in OCD or intrusive thoughts starts attacking, what if I'm actually straight? What if I went through this process of coming out and now I have to like go and redo that and all that, when really they know that through their whole life they've been attracted to the same sex, and that's been who they are, and now the OCD is coming in and attacking this. Same thing with people that are straight. The OCD will oftentimes attack and really start to put questions like, what if I'm gay, right? Or bisexual or whatever, right? And the thing is that person has, in almost every case, been very confident of who they are up to that point, and knows what causes them to be sexually aroused. And now the OCD is attacking that particular aspect of their life. So the first one would be sexuality. And then also another common one are things like, what if I'm attracted to children, right? Or, what we'd call pedophilia OCD. And this is again, a common sub form of the attack. Now, again, and I want to be clear, like this is very different than, being a true pedophile, right? Like someone who's attracted to children and is, sexually aroused by children. With pedophilia OCD, and it's the same with any other really form of OCD when it comes to sexuality, the person has no interest in engaging in any of that kind of behavior. The thoughts and the doubts of what if that happened, or what if that was possible, or what if that happened in the future, or analyzing their past to see if there was any indication that anything like that could have occurred, or like if there's ever been any kind of attraction in the past, like they'll spend their time ruminating about this. And the problem is that it has nothing to do with their sexuality, right? Because and this is what's so tricky about OCD, is it always masks itself as one problem when really OCD is the underlying problem. Okay. And it will mask it. And what I've kind of found when you really look underneath like the fears around sexuality, it generally is not this idea of like the person's homophobic or anything like that, because if you use that logic, right, that, well, the person's just homophobic and so they're worried about what if they turn gay. The thing is that if by that logic, and it's like, okay, well, why would someone who is gay worry about becoming straight? Are they straight phobic? It's like, well, no, and what you find is, if you really go to kind of the root of the fear, if you really dig underneath it, it usually is more on a level of what other people would think about them, right? And that's kind of what I found when you come from like a core fear level, when you talk to people who wrestle with these fears, right? It's a lot about that idea of social rejection, right? And fears of what other people would think. Now, not in every case, but that's just kind of like a generality. And then there's also fears of incest or ancestral acts, right? Fears, they could have sexual intrusive thoughts towards religious figures, right? That's very common when it comes to sexuality. And so again, these are going to be intrusive thoughts towards God or Jesus or the Virgin Mary, right? These kind of figures. And so what I've kind of found when it comes to intrusive thoughts around sexuality is generally the OCD and anxiety will manifest in a way where the person is having thoughts that they deem to be probably the most inappropriate things they could ever imagine for themselves, right? Or things that are just completely incongruent with who they know they really are. And what happens a lot of times is they then pursue guidance from, therapists or people that have more expertise in sexuality, and it ends up leading into more confusion, more doubt, more uncertainty, and oftentimes way is more destructive than actually getting the help with intrusive thoughts and OCD, right? Because we're talking about apples and oranges here. We're not talking about a true issue or disturbance with one's sexuality. What we're talking about is intrusive thoughts about sexuality, right? So intrusive thoughts are really the main mechanism or the main issue at hand. The content of what they're producing just latches on to these themes. And again, they could be anything, right? One's sexuality, pedophilia, incest, and these thoughts of what if that happened. They might have actual intrusive images of these events, which again usually produce a lot of anxiety and disgust for the person. They are not, again, appealing to the individual. They are not fantasies. They're very different than fantasies. And again, it's important to differentiate this idea of egosyntonic and ego dystonic thoughts, because these thoughts will fall into that ego dystonic category. And I want to talk about the broad overall concept of sexuality with intrusive thoughts, because they will latch on to all these different categories and oftentimes bounce around in between categories. And it doesn't mean that this person has 18 variations of OCD. It just means that the thoughts are manifesting in this realm. And oftentimes they will usually bounce around into the other intrusive thought themes as well, which is a big indicator of, this being an OCD and anxiety issue versus a specific content issue. Because when someone, and most of the time, people who have these intrusive thoughts will also have had a history of other types of intrusive thoughts or other manifestations of OCD and anxiety in their past. And so when you look at intrusive thoughts from this level, it's so important not to just take what the mind is saying at face value, especially the what if thinking and a lot of the rumination and analyzing that the person's engaging in, because if you try to talk out this issue, it will generally lead to more chaos and more confusion, because it'd be the same as trying to talk out someone who's if someone's wrestling with contamination OCD and you're dealing with germs and disease fears. If you try to talk out and rationalize the fear of AIDS or the fear of a certain disease, it never gets anywhere. It just is that's why ERP is the most effective treatment, is because, and I've been lost in conversations about, any and all topics you can imagine, because the moment you're trying to use logic to, the part of the brain that's activated with OCD doesn't understand language. And that's one of the biggest issues, is that people will go to a therapist or counselor and they'll try to talk out their intrusive thoughts, only to find that they leave more confused, more overwhelmed, more uncertain than ever before. Or the therapist will reassure them, which is another big compulsion, that these intrusive thoughts aren't anything to worry about, or that this isn't really what it is. And then the person will feel better, and then they'll keep going to the therapist to get reassured. So there's many dynamics here that again, I know I'm addressing on a very, kind of tip of the iceberg level, but it's important that we understand all of this collectively. It's like, if you're dealing with sexual intrusive thoughts, again, we're not talking about things that are sexually arousing or fantasies. They're very different. Okay. And so I want to separate that. Again, that idea of ego dystonic and ego syntonic. Then the idea of understanding that the thoughts will often manifest into different variations. So that's like one of the key indicators of OCD and anxiety, is the thoughts start bouncing around to different topics. They might stay on one, and it might be like the central one, but there'll usually be a history of different intrusive thoughts, or there'll be variations of other intrusive thoughts happening at the same time. And because of that, instead of trying to go into the content and analyze the specific topic that the person's obsessing about, it's so important to step back and see it from a high level OCD perspective with the loop, really understanding the behaviors the person is engaging in that is perpetuating the loop, and really work to dismantle the loop through, again, exposure response prevention, using the AAA response, and the other tools that are shown to be effective with this. So, I know this is obviously a sensitive topic, and but I know that many people with OCD and anxiety struggle with these specific thoughts, and they're often not talked about, and they're definitely usually given misguidance. Most of the people who wrestle with these things just never even bring them up because of the humiliation and shame they experience from having these unwanted intrusive thoughts. And I think it's so important that just separating this idea that these intrusive thoughts are not reflective of the individual's desires. They're not a reflective of the individual's personality. They're not some deep, dark desires for the individual. Even it really is a manifestation of stress. And just understanding that, when you start putting the behavioral tools in practice, that's why when you really break the loop, the thoughts begin to dismantle, they dissolve, and the person can go back to just living life how they normally were living before the onset of this. And it's not that they don't need to keep putting the tools into place, but it's about solving the right problem. So hope that was helpful. And if you found this episode helpful, if you're looking for help with things like this, if you're wrestling with this, please contact us over at restoredminds.com. We have various options to help you on this journey. And again, more importantly, like if you are dealing with intrusive thoughts, this is something that you can break out of, right? This is not a lifelong sentence. It's really about just understanding the problem correctly and putting the right tools into practice. So thank you so much for taking the time to hang out today. Hope this was helpful, and I wish you guys, as always, a great week. See you soon.